these transfers, we take a very deliberate approach to them. So we, working with the government of Iraq, we ask them to identify who would they like to sign for this base. And so when that happens, they identify a person well in advance that will sign and accept responsibility for that base. And then once we have that name, we coordinate with that person or that organization to conduct a series of joint inventories. And we go piece by piece, generator by generator, air conditioning unit by air conditioning unit, building by building, and we go over a joint inventory of the entire base. And then when each party is satisfied and we have our final transition, the receiving organization, in most cases, in many cases, the Iraqi Army or a unit of the Iraqi Army will sign for that equipment and obtain, and then they accept responsibility for that base and all the property inside of it. One of the things that I found kind of neat was one of these bases, I think it was Warhorse, was signed for by the Ministry of Youth and Sports. And so they intend to make that base a kind of a sports camp for Iraqi youth where they can maybe spend a week or so and learn to play soccer or things like that. And so it isn't all handing them back to the Iraqi Army or the Iraqi Air Force. The government of Iraq in some cases has kind of gone different directions and plans to give some of these bases to some of their other ministries.
Now, among the remaining 8, though, are the very largest bases, correct?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Among the remaining 8 bases that you have not turned over yet are the very largest bases you have, correct?
Oh,
like
yeah.
Balad and
Right. I think the 2 biggest bases we currently reside on are Joint Base Balad and the Victory Base Complex in the Baghdad area. Both fairly sizable U.S. sites, and both on track to transition as we plan.
Which will be the last to go?
This is one of those things where we're being kind of very discreet about which bases and our schedule for transitioning bases. And it isn't that I'm just being naturally secretive, but it's been our experience that we have found that as bases come near to transition or even on their transition day, it's been our experience that our adversaries have taken advantage of what they believe is a perceived lack in our protection status and attack us on those days. Now, that isn't the case. We remain strong until the end, but it's been our experience that we're getting some of these bases have been attacked on actually their transition day. And so in order to protect U.S. military folks and the supporting civilians and contractors, we've kind of chosen to keep this transition schedule under wraps, if you will.
And there was a GAO report that sort of warned that when you're turning over these big bases, there are things that were sort of inevitably going to pop up towards the end that you hadn't expected. Is that's been your experience or not?
That was a great report, and frankly, I read that report, cover to cover several times because there was lots of good insights in there. First off, in my experience, it was a hugely favorable report. But you're right; they did mention the fact that they didn't believe that we had properly accounted for the potential that we would find a lot of stuff. Fortunately, to this point, that has not been our experience. So in these large bases, Sykes, Cobra, because folks before me really have gone through numerous inventories and diligently searched through containers and searched their motor pools and brought what we call it bringing to record. So something that wasn't formally on our property books, they have brought it to record and documented. It's been our experience that our property books versus what actually turned up needing to be retrograded, the differences was less than 5%.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And back around to Chuck.
Yes, General, can you speak a little bit more about the situation in Kuwait? Mr. Pincus alluded to it, and I guess I'm wondering, how are we just moving stuff to Kuwait, and is there a lot of it building up there, or are we actually leaving the immediate region with much of our material?
I'm glad you asked that, frankly. You probably remember the pictures after Desert Storm, where we had these huge mountains of containers and equipment that went on for miles and miles. Frankly, you wouldn't. If when you go to Kuwait, you won't see that, and that's because I think we've gotten much better. The U.S. military has gotten much better at this business, and we shouldn't underestimate the value that computers have brought to this thing. So we're employing a lot better technology, and so in the past, when a container would get on a truck and go to Kuwait, they would open it in Kuwait, and out would spill a multitude of things, and so you'd have a pallet of Monopoly games right next to, spare parts for a tank, and so it would just be all jumbled. We've taken a very deliberate approach this time, and so up in Iraq, we have segregated stuff by commodity, so we've put all the spare parts for this kind of vehicle in this kind of container, and we've put all the kind of ammunition in that kind of container. And then another neat thing of technology is we've created this thing called a radio frequency identification tag, which I think is probably the same kind of thing which keeps you from stealing a sweater from the department store. But this kind of thing, whenever it goes by a scanner, it beeps out, and it tells every place it goes by. And we have these huge scanners by the side of the road in Kuwait and in Iraq. It tells everybody what's going down the road. And so the long and short of it is when this stuff gets to Kuwait, they know which yard to put it in, and they know which, they don't even have to open the container or look at the shipping label to know where that should go. And so our experience thus far in Kuwait is that we're achieving a velocity that we really had thus far never seen before in military operations.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
And Spencer.
Sort of a two-parter with this one. First, what would the expense be relative of bringing troops after they've left Iraq and Kuwait back to Iraq, vice just keeping some troops in Iraq following a request from the Iraqi government? And relatedly, are there any plans post-withdrawal to hedge in 2012, to hedge against that expense by just keeping, I don't know, an AAD or other size unit in Kuwait for the prospect of returning to Iraq pending a request?
Yeah. Thank you for that. As you could probably intuitively guess, it would be fairly costly to leave a base, transition it, and then, especially if it wasn't completely well maintained, then have to move back in. Any base that we would even, if the Iraqis were to ask for a presence, we anticipate that all that presence would probably be on existing Iraqi bases. And so making the assumption that the government of Iraq continues to maintain those sites, the expense may be fairly modest. If that assumption were not to be proven to prove the case, and we had to go back and establish a lot of what we would call infrastructure, the plumbing and the electricity and that type of thing, that would be fairly costly. The cost involved in getting the actual people back, not so much. But if we had to renovate and reestablish some of these items of infrastructure, that would be, fairly costly. And so that's why we've been working so hard with the government of Iraq in these discussions to actually see what they were going to request.
And on the prospect of any plans that exist to keep some troops in Kuwait as a hedge against the expenses of bringing them back to the U.S. from home, back to Iraq from home, sorry.
Yeah, I think...
Do any such plans exist?
I think we would kind of want our U.S. military to get reunited with their families as quickly as we can. And so I think rather than kind of keep people in Kuwait, we would be inclined to return them. The real cost in military operations, frankly, has become the cost of transporting equipment. The people costs are fairly modest in comparison. And I'm not aware of any plans to keep people in Iraq only to, in the event that the Iraqis might request U.S. military forces of some kind. I'll mention one thing we're gonna suggest to the Iraqis as time goes on, and that is joint exercises. We conduct a number of exercises with our strategic partners. Egypt comes to mind. And so I know it's on the mind of some of the U.S. military leaders that they'd like to set up a similar exercise program with the Iraqis where we can train together and that type of thing. But I'm not aware that those plans have come along too far at this point.